Hello, everybody. Welcome to another session of webinar for ActiveReports. My name is Mateen Feroz. I am the product manager for ActiveReports. We're going to go ahead and get started here. What we're going to do today is just go over an overview of ActiveReports. We're going to do a couple of quick polls just to get a feel for the audience. Then we'll get into the topics of cloud technology and the benefits and the disadvantages of cloud, deploying a application to the cloud as a standalone monolith application as a web service, web app. And then we'll talk a little bit about scaling that application to be a little more distributable with Azure Functions and triggers. And then we'll wrap it up. In the meantime, while we proceed with the discussions, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to send them through the chat or the questions panels in Zoom. And as they come in, we'll go ahead and answer them, or we'll get to them towards the end of the session. We'll also have a Q&A session at that time. So if there are any questions, feel free to send them. You don't have to wait till the end, and we'll address them to the best of my ability during this webinar. If there are any questions that I cannot answer, I will certainly look for the answer and send you an email with that information. With that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So as for the overview of ActiveReports, as you might know, ActiveReports has been around since 1998. Since then, it has been one of the first, industry's first, to have an integrated report designer, so a Visual Studio integrated report designer. And it's also the first, it was also the first third-party control to have a end user report designer. And since then, we have been continuing the pioneering efforts in the reporting solutions. We have a .NET version as well as a JavaScript version of ActiveReports. Among these two teams, we have over 60 developers, support specialists, sales and account managers, and product managers dedicated to our customers. So whereas other teams might have 60 developers dedicated to a bunch of products, we have all of those dedicated to ActiveReports, and making sure that ActiveReports is developed in a way that you as developers have the ability to use the most and get the most out of it, as opposed to trying to fight with the software and try to make it fit. The features that we introduce are always in unison with the trends that we see in the industry. So the features that we have incorporated into ActiveReports, some of them you'll see today, essentially they are developed for you and your use. With that being said, let me go ahead and start a couple of polls here. And the polls essentially, it will help me to sort of understand, the audience, like I said, making sure that here we have, the information that we present is relevant to you guys. So if you would, please take a moment and fill out the surveys, the polls rather. All right, so we are getting there. All right, looks like the majority of us are here to learn more about ActiveReports.net, as well as cloud and serverless computing. And section reports, code-based section reports seem to be the most prominent answer for the second question there. All right, let's go ahead and share that with you guys so you can see here the results of this poll. So with that being said, we will go ahead and proceed with the webinar. Thank you again for filling out that information. All right, let's go ahead and continue here. Yes, okay, so Visual Studio 2022 compatibility, yes, that is something that we are working on. So we will have an announcement on that soon. Internally, the tests are being done with version 15. Version 16 will be coming out, and it will have full support for 2022 as well. All right, so getting into the topic of cloud technologies. Obviously, the benefits and the advantages of cloud are many. The first and foremost, of course, is cost reduction. You can imagine if you have if you have servers in house, you have to maintain those servers. You would need staff to maintain those servers, and if your industry grows or if your business grows, you need to scale up or scale down based on your needs. Purchasing new software, purchasing new hardware, all of this can definitely add up in costs. So offloading that to a third party, letting them take care of all of the infrastructure and the hardware, that saves a lot of cost for you as a consumer of these cloud services. And in addition to that, cloud is scalable. Cloud technology is scalable, so you can again scale up and down depending on your needs fairly quickly. And this allows you the flexibility to change your business strategies, as opposed to just being stuck with purchasing and installing expensive hardware and software by yourself. The provider, the cloud provider, would do that for you. Another point of advantage for cloud technologies is that your data is always backed up. So in cases where there are natural disasters, in the east part of the world, there's always tsunamis and floods and whatnot. So in those types of situations, you don't want the business to stop with data being backed up, your applications being backed up. Data is secure. Your business can continue even though the region may be dealing with some natural disaster. So in addition to that, security is a huge thing, right? So if your data is backed up and secure, that's one less thing for you to worry about. When you have teams scattered throughout the world, dispersed throughout the world, you want them to be able to collaborate. So a shared workspace, a shared area for them to, or shared projects for them to collaborate on, is much easier with cloud technologies, because you can give access and permissions to those projects to for different various team members to collaborate on. Security, I touched on earlier a little bit. Security is somewhat of a risk as well as a benefit, depending on the model of deployment, cloud deployment that you choose. For example, for private cloud environments, security is definitely an advantage because you control all of it. You control, the security aspect of it. For public cloud environments, it can be a nuisance. It can be something that you need to pay attention to. For example, data protection, although it is offered by Microsoft and AWS, Azure and AWS, and the like, it may not be sufficient for certain sensitive data, right? So certain companies and certain organizations that have very sensitive data, they might not be the data protection might not be sufficient up to their standards, what is offered by these third-party providers. Additionally, some organizations may have some regional or geographic restrictions where their data can be housed. So they might not want their data housed in this particular region of the world. So these are some nuances of cloud computing that need to be kept in mind, that might be important for your organization, your company. In some scenarios, though, like I mentioned, if you have a private cloud environment, excuse me, in these types of scenarios, having a private cloud environment can be initially, it can have an initial high cost because you have to maintain the hardware. You have to have an IT professional available to take care of the setup and the networking and everything like that. So the initially there might be a high cost to start with cloud technology. The second point of disadvantage is that there are some, you need to understand the security measures, basically, right? So you need to understand some of the security measures, like I mentioned earlier, that there might be some regional or some SLA considerations that you need to take into account. And then bandwidth is another issue. If you have a setup or an environment where multiple organizations are sharing the same resources, the bandwidth is shared, so that could be an issue that might arise. And then the last thing that I'll mention is connectivity, right? And this is an obvious point that in order to be able to work on the cloud, you have to have connectivity. To be able to deploy, you have to have connectivity to the cloud environment. And this is generally more of an issue on the users end, so on our end, as opposed to the providers. So it's more likely that you and I would have a power outage, for example, or a internet outage, as opposed to Microsoft Azure services being down, or Google Cloud being down, or AWS being down. So these are some things that we need to take into consideration as we consider cloud deployment. So as we're talking about cloud deployment, there are a couple of different models. Mainly, there are 4 prominent models, but for our purposes, we will be focusing only on the first 2, as they are the most often used. So public and private. Obviously, public is when you, for example, if you go to Azure and you open up a subscription, basically they have resources and infrastructure available that they rent out, and you basically rent a portion of their services and pay a monthly charge or whatnot. And so you basically get to use those services from them. So the infrastructure is owned by a third party, for example, Microsoft, but you're allowed to store your data on those third-party servers. Now, again, from a security perspective, this might not be acceptable to some organizations, so they would opt to have an internal or private cloud environment. And so because of the increasing number of increasing interest in this private cloud environment, Microsoft and other providers, they also offer private cloud environments. So they can dedicate for example, an infrastructure, a server for a particular user, and that user would be able to use that, so that only that user would have access to that particular server. Alternatively, those servers can be on premises, so they could be owned by the organization themselves, and managed by the organization themselves. So private can be, both managed by the organization as well as by the likes of Microsoft. So just taking these 2 into consideration, just sort of compare these 2 models here. Obviously, when it comes to infrastructure setup, private is going to require a lot more effort from the organization, because you would need a professional to basically set everything up. The hardware is, again, it can be on-prem or operated and managed by the third party. But as far as security levels and control over data and reliability, private environments certainly outweigh outperform the public. But as far as scalability and cost, the public is much better as opposed to compared to the private. Right. So you can take a look at this a little bit on your at leisure, at your leisure. The next thing that we want to take a look at as we're moving on is essentially deployment to Microsoft Azure. So we're going to use Azure as an example for our purposes here. When we're talking about deployment, there's a couple of ways, or a few different ways to deploy an application to an Azure account. The first thing you can do essentially is deploy to a VM. So you can have an Azure VM initiated on your in your subscription, and use that as a server to host your applications. Now, this requires a lot more time and effort from your side. So from a cost perspective and a management perspective, it requires more from you because obviously you have to maintain the VM. Microsoft Azure, for example, is not going to maintain it. That's your responsibility. You would maintain it. So the cost and management is going to require a lot more from you. The second method to deploy is to deploy as a web app, right? As a monolith, as a standalone web app. Now, this gives you a lot more flexibility. It gives you a lot, it's easier to deal with, it's easier to deploy, and it's easier to, from a DevOps perspective as well, that you can, update and deploy fairly quickly, fairly easily. And we'll see this in a little bit. We'll go ahead and show how this is done, using Azure Web Services. And with this, the entire maintenance is done by the provider. So in this case, Azure. Now, when you have this monolith, again, you're sort of stuck with the architecture that you build this application with. If you wanted to scale that application further, then the best thing to do is to create and split that monolith into several functions, and create more of a function as a service, so more of a fast type of a architecture. And again, we'll see this as well towards the end of this webinar. Now, a couple of points with regards to these three deployment models. Now, obviously, this is not all of it, and you can deploy to containers and whatnot. So this is certainly not the all-inclusive list of deployment methods, but these are essentially the top that we want to focus on. As far as the VMs go, like I mentioned, they are more expensive in comparison to the app service. Excuse me. But the app service might have some constraints, in comparison to, for example, the Azure VM in terms of scalability. And at the same time, it will have VMs will have more control. It will give you more control over the environment. For example, in web services, in app services, you're not able to control or choose the operating system to which the version of the operating system to which it is being deployed. But you have that control with a VM. Let's see what else. There are also other controls, other constraints rather, for support of programming languages and whatnot with app services. So in this case, you might want to use a VM for that. Now, going through these three, so let me actually bring up my Visual Studio and just go through a deployment process of a application. Now, what you're seeing here, this is a JS viewer application targeting .NET 5 that we've created. It has some reports built into it. And essentially, it's just a basic application that renders some reports and displays them in a JS viewer. Now, to deploy this application, essentially all that you would need to do, and because it already has the packages included in it, all that you would need to do is just right click the project and publish. So to publish, you select Azure, and here are the different ways that you can, publish this to an Azure environment. The first one obviously is the first two are Azure services, and then at the bottom is where you have the VM, right? The virtual machine. So you could choose a virtual machine and create the virtual machine, or if you have an existing one, just publish to that. But for our purposes, we're going to use the app service, right? So select the Windows. We could select the Linux and then publish to the Linux, but we'll select the Windows for the time being. Then on this screen, on the app service screen here, since I'm already logged into my account, it will have my resource groups listed here, right? So if your resource group is not listed, you would want to add it. So when you press that add button, then you're able to basically customize the resource group that shows up here, right? If the hosting plan doesn't have anything, you can create new. For the size, for example, you can just share. You can use the free hosting plan. We'll leave it as this here, as it is right now, and just use that, right? So if we select the resource group and the hosting plan here, we can go ahead and click finish, and it will deploy this application to the server. So this is going to take a little bit of time to completely deploy. Actually, it didn't take a lot of time to completely deploy. All right, and it gives you the URL. Now I have another application that I have deployed previously, and this is a little bit more of a interactive application. So I'll use that for the purposes of this webinar. So this is an MVC, .NET Core MVC web-based report designer application. As you can see, this loads a report designer UI here for us. This UI, obviously, this is an end user report designer that we created for end users with non-technical folks in mind. So the UI you can see is geared towards the non-technical folks with the Office inspired ribbon, the slimmed down properties panel, right? So if I go to properties mode, advanced, you have a lot more functionality. Whereas, for the non-technical folks, the basic would be sufficient. But we also have the file menu here, which lists a bunch of samples here that we can open, and the user would be able to edit, right? So now the user is able to preview this and export as they see fit to a export format of their choice, right? So a very simple application that very simply you could deploy very, very easily. This is the positive of app services, that it's very easy to deploy, it's very easy to manage, and it's something that you don't have to spend a lot of time and a lot of money maintaining. And then the updates are fairly easy as well. So if you were to change anything in the project, add more report files, for example, change some displays and change some UI, you just come back and publish again, and it will be published again to the same resource group, right? All right. So this has been simple enough, right? This was simple enough. If we continue on, what can we do from here? Say you have, you have this monolith application, but you need it to be more dynamic. You need it to be, scaled up a little bit more. So how can you do that? And you can do that with Azure Functions, right? So with that in mind, imagine that you have like an application. Imagine you have an application that essentially needs to be available on demand. So whenever people need it, it needs to be available online on demand, but it's not used all the time. Like a mobile app, right? It's not used all the time 24/7, but it's on demand, that whenever people need it, it's there for them. So that type of an application, if it's a web application or something like that, then if it's supposed to be available on demand, then it needs to be running 24/7, right? So in case somebody needs it. But this adds up a lot to your costs. It adds a lot to your costs and your maintenance. The alternative is that you can create, Azure Functions, and Azure Functions will help in that regard. So Azure Functions essentially is like a serverless solution that you can maintain without like infrastructure and saving on costs. So it is something that is event-driven, event-driven architecture, and it's stateless and on demand, available on demand, right? So it's that's basically what it is. Imagine, another scenario, another use case would be, for example, if you have an existing like legacy application, and you're not able to take that down, you're not able to bring it down and maintain it or remodify it, in some way, then creating APIs for that application would basically serve that purpose of modifying the functionality of that legacy app, right? So this is where Azure Functions can help, right? This is where Azure Functions can help you, and essentially just take your application more to a scalable solution that is available, again, on demand, where the infrastructure is updated not by you but the providers, right? So in this case, Azure, and so it provides this serverless computing experience from Azure. Now, obviously, Azure is not the only one that offers functions. Google has Cloud Functions as well. Other providers have other offerings as well. But this is one of the options that you have available at your disposal. Now, the thing with these functions is that everything, because it's event driven, it's like triggers, right? Event triggers. Essentially, you have several triggers available to choose from based on your need, right? So you have the HTTP, which is basically an HTTP request comes in, and a response is sent back. A timer trigger is, for example, if you want to schedule a report to be sent to a manager or an executive, every month or every week. You would use a timer trigger so that on Monday at 8 o'clock in the morning, the sales report is sent to the manager. These types of triggers are available, and you would use the event grid for sending the email. The queue trigger, essentially, you would have a queue of events, a queue of tasks to be done. That would be in your queue trigger, right? So there's a lot of these triggers, and we'll see some of these in the coming in just a little bit. Now, before we actually go to the demo of actually showing Azure Functions and creating a Azure Function app, just let's take a look at a scenario so that we have some background to work with, right? So let's take a look at something, a scenario where functions that Azure Functions would help. So imagine the small business that has an online store, or maybe the customers place orders online, or calling the store and placing orders over the phone. Now, because they're a small business, they're fairly small. Everything is done manually, so orders are taken manually, and the invoices are generated and emailed to customers manually. Managers, if they need to look at sales and sales trends, basically have to do it manually querying the databases, and so forth. Right? Now, as they grow, they need to their applications need to scale with them, right? So their website needs to scale, their reporting needs to scale, everything needs to change. In this case, for example, for the first point where customers receive emails, instead of the associates sending emails directly to customers manually, this can be automated using Azure Functions, right? So when a customer places an order, there is a queue that takes place where the order is generated and taken, and a PDF invoice is generated using ActiveReports, and that PDF invoice is saved in Azure storage. Then an email is generated with this attachment, with this PDF as an attachment, and sent to the customer with SendGrid. Similarly, if we wanted to implement the manager's weekly emails, with a weekly report of sales trends, it will be the same sort of a procedure. Instead of being an HTTP trigger, where in the case of the customer, where they place an order and it's an HTTP trigger, in this case, for the manager, it would be a timer trigger, so that every Monday morning at 8 o'clock, at 8 a.m. or 7:50 a.m., the timer triggers, and a report layout that is already defined and already created is run. A PDF is exported, and then a email is created with SendGrid, and the PDF is attached to the email and sent to the manager. Right. So these are essentially the steps that would logically take place for these two scenarios. So this is basically what we're going to work towards. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Azure Functions demo. So how do we create such an application? So for the sake of time, I have a Azure Functions app that I've already created. Now, what I'll do is I will add another function to this, and you'll be able to see how Visual Studio basically has these templates available for you to use. That you could easily create these Azure function applications, or the functions themselves, function classes themselves. So with this application, I already have the dependencies listed here. So ActiveReports and the blobs, where we're going to be storing the PDFs. And I also have a couple of reports here that we will be using to export to PDF and store save to Azure storage. Right. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to right click the project, and we're going to add a new Azure function. Okay. So when the Azure function comes in, let's go ahead and name it here. So let's say HTTP request. Right. Okay. So we're going to hit OK, add rather, and another window pops up, and this gives us a list of the triggers that are available for us to use. So you can see all of the triggers here. So the timer trigger, the queue trigger, the blob trigger is when something gets added to your Azure storage account. You have the SendGrid over here at the bottom. You have a lot more at the bottom as well, but we're going to be using the HTTP trigger. We're going to change the authorization level to anonymous. Now, if we leave it as default to function, basically we'll be asked to pass a function key later on. So I don't want to do that. So in order to avoid that, we're going to change this authorization level to anonymous. So let's go ahead and add this function. So now we have the function here. Let's take a look at this file real quick. This function name here obviously defines the name of this function, right? So when you deploy it, this basically is going to be this name, right? The next set of lines, essentially, this defines the run method, basically defines the function, that it is an HTTP request, and that it is an HTTP trigger rather, and it has a request, and the request has certain properties. Namely, we'll be using the name property for this demo here. And then basically it just says if there is a name passed in the URL, there's an entry passed in the URL for the name, then type in or pass respond with this. Otherwise, just respond generically, right? So let's go ahead. Let's see if we run this, what's going to happen. So let's, and this thing is in my way. Okay. Do this. There we go. Okay. So I'm running the application now. What's going to happen is it's going to run an emulator. So let me bring that emulator here. All right. This emulator essentially is going to give me a URL. And the URL for this, we created the HTTP request, right? So we're going to copy this URL and go to our browser, right? And let's paste that. And let's say we're going to say name is equal to routine. Okay, what's going to happen is we passed a value to the name, and then it sent the response, right? Hello, Mateen, and this function executed successfully, right? Simple enough, right? There's not much to this application. Now we can add to this application, like I said, instead of passing in Mateen to this name, what we're going to do is pass the name of a report. So we're going to pass the name of this product sales report. Okay. So what that's going to do is when we're going to make this code so that when the name of the report is passed here, we're going to want to render that report, export it to PDF, and then save that PDF to a Azure storage. So this is going to be our task, right? So we're going to change this application a little bit. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to set up our Azure storage. Now, when you create your Azure storage account in your Azure portal, you will get a connection string. Now, this connection string is specific to your account and to your excuse me, Azure storage. So we're going to essentially just use this connection string to connect to our Azure storage and the container. All right, so I'm going to paste in some code here. Let me just paste it here. Okay. Yeah. So obviously the lines here is basically because I don't have the statements, the using statements here, right? All right, so we have the connection string, and we're using that basically to connect to the service client, the blob service client, and the cloud storage account. We're creating an instance of it using the connection string here, and then we're creating a container, right? And we're creating this container and giving it a name. It's gonna need to be a unique name. So it's going to be, we're using the GUID toString to give it a unique name. And then we're just basically creating the containers and creating the clients and the blocks to basically link and connect to our container within Azure Storage. And Azure Storage, you can think of it like as a file system, right? So and the containers are a folder. So you can have a container that contains multiple blob files. And then you can have multiple folders containing multiple blobs. So you can have multiple of these containers, but for our purposes, we're just going to work with this. So this code that I've pasted here essentially is just connecting us to our Azure account, right? Azure storage account. All right. Now, what we're going to do is I'm actually going to use this and change this name property a little bit here, and we're going to add .pdf. Because again, we're going to pass the name, and I want to create the PDF from this report with the same name, right? So that's why I'm changing this name to a PDF. Okay, so we've connected to our database. We've connected to our Azure storage. The next thing that we need to do is set up the path to our report file. So we want to set up the path to this particular report. Okay, so we're just going to use a local path and basically get the path, a relative path to the reports folder. And within the reports folder, we're going to look for anything that is RDLX that matches the name that we've passed, right? And then local file path obviously is a combination of the two. All right. The last thing is, so we've basically done connecting to our Azure account. We've located our report file. The only thing left to do is to render the report using ActiveReports APIs and to export it to PDF, right? And then store it to the Azure storage. So to do that, I'm going to bring in some pieces of some lines of code here. These lines of code, essentially all they do is, again, using the APIs, it takes that page report, right? It loads that page report into an instance of RDL report, rather, I should say, into a page report instance. And then it basically gives it some settings. It basically gives it some, the PDF uses the PDF rendering extension for exporting to PDF. And then it saves it to a memory stream, right? It saves it to a memory stream. And that memory stream is basically used to upload to our blob, right? And upload the blob through the memory stream, so we don't have a physical file saved anywhere. And that should pretty much be it. So now, if I run this application now, we'll still, it'll still build, all right? It will still build the application, and we'll still get the emulator that comes up. Right, and it will still give us the same URL, right? So if we go to the browser now, it's the same URL. So all I have to do is just change the name input, product sales, right? Product sales. And it's going to show that it's working. And it's going to be exporting it to PDF and upload it to, and you can see the message changed here. That means it's basically succeeded, right? So now how do we check? If we go to our Visual Studio, right, and the Cloud Explorer is open here, it basically shows, all my subscriptions to Microsoft Azure. So if I expand the subscription here, we have the storage account. And this is my storage account and the blob containers here. And here is the report, right? So we're defined the name here, right? The container name, reports, and this is the GUID, right? So if I double click it, we have a PDF of product sales that is saved to the Azure account, Azure storage account. Now, if I were to use the browser and go navigate to my Azure portal and find this particular container in my storage account, I will still see this PDF file, right? So that's basically it, right? This is essentially the way we could split up a single monolith application into different pieces, so that one piece is essentially creating the PDF, and then the other piece is sending and attaching it to an email. So the email again would be sent by SendGrid. I don't have the subscription for SendGrid, so that's not part of this webinar. But essentially, the idea is the same: that you would generate the triggers in the same way. You would generate the triggers in the same way that we just generated using HTTP trigger. Deployment is fairly simple with this as well. So if we go and right click on function and say publish, this has already been published. This application has already been published, but since I made some changes, I can go ahead and hit publish again, and it will update the changes and republish the application, and the URL will be shown here, right? Okay, so Azure Functions obviously makes things a lot simpler, allows us to break things down into bite-sized pieces so that we can manage them a lot easier. Let me go back to my presentation. As time is running short. So this has been the presentation essentially on cloud reporting. and how you can use ActiveReports within Azure environments, including Azure Functions and Azure Web Services. The next steps that we would ask you to do, ask you to take up is after this webinar ends, you will have an opportunity to submit a post-session survey to answer. It's eight questions, literally. It won't take you very long at all, but it will give us a lot of insight, a lot of help planning and preparing for our next webinars. So if you could fill out that survey, it would definitely help us out a lot. If you're new to ActiveReports, you can download the 30-day free trial using the link here, or you can go to the website and download from there as well. Even if you're using an older version of ActiveReports, you're still able to download ActiveReports 15 free trial as well. And if you're, again, new to ActiveReports and you're interested in learning more about ActiveReports and having a personalized demo catered to you and your reporting needs, you can use the link here to request a personalized demo, and the team will essentially jump on and just get some information from you and cater a personal demo, just showcasing ActiveReports and ActiveReports features to you. And if you have any questions from a sales perspective, licensing or whatnot, you can always reach out to sales. And like I said, your feedback is extremely valuable for us. Whatever feedback it may be, whether it's something we did well or something we didn't do well, we want to hear from you. If it's a bug that you found or a feature request that you have, please keep in touch with us. Your feedback and connection is very important for us. So with that, I will shut up and leave the floor open if you guys have any questions. Other than that, my email address is here. Feel free to email me if you have any questions, if you have any concerns, or if you have, if there's anything that we didn't get to touch on today. I'd be more than happy to expand on those things. So we already have some questions. Let me look through here. So when can we expect information on Visual Studio 22 updates? So yes, we will have an email going out in the next few weeks, so 3 or 4 weeks or so. We should have an email going out. But when Visual Studio 22 comes out, we definitely will update you guys on the support for that as well. Okay. Steve saying, being a longtime customer, starting with V2, I'd be interested in learning the pros and cons of using the JS product over a server-side solution. Yes, okay, so we do have ActiveReports JS. So this particular product, ActiveReports JS, is solely client-side, so it renders the reports on the browser. It has no server dependencies. There are a lot of, that in and of itself gives you a lot of control, a lot of benefits to use ActiveReports JS. One of the biggest things that I've heard from customers with regards to ActiveReports JS is that they can dynamically just go into the JSON layout of the report file and just change it in the code itself. That's something that they find very, very useful, especially being on the client side. They find that very useful. On the flip side, because it does run on the browser, it is limited by the capabilities of the browser. So if you have large reports, like extensively large reports, then you would need you would benefit more from ActiveReports.net as opposed to ActiveReports JS. And then ActiveReports JS also currently supports JSON data sources. So if you have the need to connect to other data sources or data sets, you would need ActiveReports.net. Just a couple of points to keep in mind with regards to the pros and cons and the differences between the two. Hopefully that answered your question, Steve. If not, please let me know. Okay, any other questions? Okay, if there are no other questions, then I can go ahead and end the webinar. Again, I do appreciate you guys joining in and listening in on the webinar. Hopefully it has been beneficial for you guys. Hopefully it was something that will be able to help you guys embrace or at least consider cloud migration. So with that, I will end the webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Other than that, please do fill out the survey, the survey that will be launched as soon as we end here. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Thank you very much.